to be talking to a truly incredible entrepreneur and innovator in the nuclear space, Caroline Cochran. And we're going to be talking about the work that she and the team are doing at Oklo. So to get our conversation underway, can you join me in welcoming Caroline?
All right.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I said when we were talking backstage that I thought probably not a bad place to start is just doing a kind of a 101 on what we're talking about, because it can be a pretty, we tend to talk in generalities when we talk about nuclear, right? We use the term nuclear energy. And specifically, you're working on building powerhouses, which are advanced fission power plants. So can you break it down for us?
Yeah.
When we talk about the nuclear umbrella, what are we talking about? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about Oklo, which part of the nuclear puzzle are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Nuclear power usually refers to fission, which is when neutrons are flying around, they hit heavy atoms, they split them apart and create an immense amount of energy. And so that's the fissioning of the atom. And then that fissioning actually also creates not just a bunch of energy, but a couple more neutrons that fly around, and hopefully one of them hits an atom. And then when those reach a chain reaction of stable proportions, so it's kind of constantly creating fissions in a steady state, that's called, fission. So that's what makes the energy, and sometimes we say it's a fancy way of boiling water. In our case, with advanced fission, we're not boiling water, we don't require water, and so we're able to actually use waste as fuel, and there's some other characteristics in terms of safety and other characteristics for advanced fission.
Cool, and the other thing I wanted to ask you about in your description is on a microgrid scale. So can you talk to us about that component?
Yeah.
Because when people think of nuclear, I think they think of the big power plants, right?
Yeah.
So what does microgrid mean?
Huge, yeah. Usually these might be on the order of 1,000 megawatts. What we're looking at is more on the order of under 20. So hundreds of times smaller generally than the big power plants that people see or think of when they think of nuclear power.
So many questions. The first one that's obvious to me is, how do you end up being a nuclear energy entrepreneur? How did Oklo start, and what's your journey to Oklo?
Yeah. I mean, I started off as a mechanical engineer in undergrad, and I just loved engineering. I was involved in designing race cars and solar cars, and just learning about energy in general that way. And I started encountering different nuclear engineers and started realizing, like many people probably, I was like, this seems strange. Should I trust this? It seems dangerous. And then I learned so much about the potential there and like how it has the capability and has actually deeply decarbonized. And I became sold. And so I applied for basically reapplied to grad school for nuclear engineering.
Wow.
Went to MIT for grad school, and that's where I met my co-founders passionate about these advanced fission. So I learned about nuclear, and then I learned about advanced fission. I was like, this is even cooler. And he had a passion for starting a company, and I was like, well, I've done startups since, at this point I've been involved in startups for decades. So I was like, of course I'm going to be part of this. So that's kind of where it started.
I feel like to reapply for grad school, you've got to really believe in the potential. So what was it that really grabbed you? Can you remember, was there a moment that was quite definitive in terms of something you realized or knew about nuclear that made you go, this is it, this is what I want to be involved in?
Yeah, I guess I'd love to say there's like a certain moment where it was like a light bulb, but I think it was kind of more gradual. Like I met one nuclear engineer and they told me some things. I met another one, and I had an internship at the Pentagon in DC, and I was like, well, this is interesting, and there were nuclear engineers there. Got involved in policy and started really caring about climate. And this will date me a little bit, but I saw Al Gore's like Inconvenient Truth around that time of my life, and it just became more and more and more like, this is what I want to do with my life, is be involved in this technology. So yeah, I was all set to go to Columbia for grad school in mechanical and doing probably like robotics, and I was like, robotics seems so small and inconsequential in comparison with something that has the energy density of like the capability of producing million times more energy than any other power source.
So when you and your co-founder found each other, what was the initial problem you were trying to solve at Oklo? And how's that maybe evolved over time too? Because I know you've been on a bit of a journey, right?
Yeah, it's like, there's nuclear, and then there's these advanced technologies which have these amazing safety and other benefits, like being able to use nuclear waste as fuel. But when we were thinking about it, it's like, well, who actually wants this, right? Like you could have the coolest technology in the world, and this is something I learned as a mechanical engineer too, is just like, hey, just because you think something's cool doesn't mean there's a market for it. So I think what we really realized is, like, is there a market? And very quickly we were just talking to some people. Actually, we rented a room in our house on Airbnb way back in the day, and some of our very first actually tenants were just telling us about how they lived in Alaska, maybe not unlike many areas of Canada, and it's hard for people to even get power, and they're relying on diesel power, and we're like, would you be interested if we could make small-scale advanced fission to power those areas, and it can produce emission-free power 24/7 and never need refueling ever, so you're not in danger of losing your power?
It's
and
an
they're
intense breakfast table conversation. I like it.
They're like, yeah, we'd use that. But then we kept seeing other, more and more different applications that really needed this right away. Energy poverty and just areas where they are relying on diesel and it's dirty and it's unreliable and it's really challenging. So we're like, hey, there's a market and there's a technology, so let's make this happen.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about that market. How do you think about who your customer is?
Yeah. It's funny because I think when you start presenting that, and it's like, yeah, there's kind of so many different things you can start with, like so many different aspects. But it's like, hey, if we can make small-scale emission-free power that's 24/7, different people just come up with different solutions, needs. They're like, oh, could you do this? Could you do that? And so it's like, you could power remote communities. It's probably an obvious one. Data centers need always-on power, and they're trying to decarbonize. But you name it, we've heard it. Vertical indoor farming, especially in remote areas where it's really cold and dark, and they don't have fresh produce. We've heard the gamut. So it's really like our customers are all over the map.
And I should say, if you want to jump in and ask a question, either about Caroline's entrepreneurial journey, nuclear tech, jump into Slido. We'd love to take some audience questions as well. I wanted to ask you, one of the things from the outside looking in that I can imagine every entrepreneur talks about the challenges they have on an entrepreneurial journey. I can't help but think being an entrepreneur in an industry that has a lot of preconceptions, stigma associated with it, poses unique challenges.
Yeah.
What's been the biggest challenge in the Oklo journey or your entrepreneurial journey with Oklo so far?
It's interesting. You're bringing up kind of the social challenges, which is like how people perceive nuclear power. And I think maybe especially when we started this around 10 years ago, that was different than even it is now. And I think what I found is, I think all these people are like, oh, the public won't want that. But over and over, polling has showed that people tend to support it. They just think their neighbor doesn't. And so learning about this and talking to people about it, I think what we've seen is people realize that climate is such an imperative that we need all the tools at the table. So I've seen less of that. Our biggest challenge really has ended up being that people within this industry, especially more stodgy, older people from within the nuclear industry are like, why are you trying to do something new here? Why are you trying to rock the boat? So it's almost like our own industry is more of a challenge, I think, than public perception or anything else.
And how have you navigated that so far? What have you done to sort of maintain the course and not get demotivated by that?
Yeah, it's hard not to be demotivated by it, honestly. But I think what really carries us through is just having an amazing team and believing in the mission. And so you kind of don't worry too much about the haters on the sides.
Yeah. We've talked a lot over the program so far about the challenges in scaling and financing different forms of energy technology. How has that posed much of a challenge for you at Oklo?
Yeah, I think what we really when you start with the market in mind, and so you can draw clear milestones for yourself, what funding you need to get to those milestones, and what is the revenue on the backside. One of the awesome things, and I'm sure you've been discussing this at Disruptors, is energy is the biggest market in the world. And so it's huge, but also it's trying to deeply decarbonize. And so if you can really show in thoughtful ways how you get from here to there, and you're thoughtful about your milestones and your spend rate. So we've been incredibly scrappy, and starting with this small power plant size was deliberate on our part, not just because of the market, but also because we saw it as a venture scale, investable way to get to the end point. So far in this industry, what often you would see is, big players like GE and Westinghouse waiting for huge contracts on billions of dollars or huge amounts of government funding. And we said, we can't wait for the government. You have to have something that's venture scale with a clear market and clear milestones to reach your goals. And I think we saw we were one of the first companies to really raise a venture-led Series A in this space, which is challenging, I'm not gonna lie. Like, investors are used to calling their buddies in whatever space and say, hey, have you heard about this deal? Like, what do you think about it? And there's none of that. Like, there's not that network in Fission, or there wasn't, especially when we started. I think now there really is. But at that time, they didn't know how to do due diligence. They were like calling up their uncle that like had a physics degree, and they're like, do you think this makes sense? So I think like, yeah, it was very challenging, but we did have kind of like the vision for how we would finance it from the beginning.
I want to ask you about that though, overcoming that piece of nobody really having ventured in, pardon the venture capital pun, into that territory before. There's a lot of people sitting in this room who are innovating in their own way in a part of the ecosystem here. How did you tackle that challenge of having to explain yourself, make your business case to people that didn't have a reference point for it?
Yeah. Yeah, and most of the credit there goes really to my co-founder. So, I think one of the advice, so we went through Y Combinator, a startup accelerator, and I think a lot of them give similar advice, but it's like, you have to divvy up responsibilities between the founders, and so my co-founder really managed the investor relationships. But it was a huge challenge, and it continues to be, just because even as we were one of the first to do a Series A, doing Series B, we thought it would be a lot easier. In a way, it is, because you already have all these invested investors that want to carry through their investment and get their pro rata, but also it's a different scale, and so you have to bring on more people and educate them in a different way. There's also different mechanisms, though, that are coming forward and more prominence about how do you, now that we're getting closer to actually doing a build, how do you do project financing and other types of financing, not just equity financing. So it's getting more interesting and kind of really fascinating.
I want to ask you, you mentioned a couple of times your co-founder. It's one great example of collaboration at work.
Yeah.
Why was that the way you ended up starting the business? And what are sort of the strengths that both of you bring to the table, do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're very complementary in that. He's the CEO and I'm the COO, and I think our skill sets actually align pretty well there. Both of us being engineers, I think at different times we've picked up almost like a CTO role, which we don't really have like a CTO, but I think like it's ended up being really complementary that I handled the operations aspects and the regulatory aspects, and he handled the financial and honestly more of like a CTO type role and the investor stuff. So yeah, it is really important. We're also married, by the way.
Oh,
and
there we go.
And
so you can mix work and play, hey?
Yeah, but also I think in such a long life scale startup, hopefully you have a co-founder that has not only a similar mission and values, but like is it in for the long haul, and you guys work well together for a long period of time to really see something through to fruition that takes that long.
Can only imagine the dinner table conversations, hey? Now, I want to ask you, before we come to audience questions, and thank you for those of you who are submitting, you mentioned a term before that we've heard a couple of times on this stage, but I don't think we've properly lent into, which is energy poverty. Can you explain a little bit more about that and how you're part of the solution to it?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I love about coming to Canada is it's very familiar to people in Canada about people in the northern areas, Indigenous peoples, and the lack of access to resources. And energy tends to be right at the nexus or the center of that, I think. So not having energy also leads to not having lighting, not having refrigeration, not having access to internet, and so many other things that we take for granted in areas where that's more readily available, or you're on the grid. So off-grid or microgrid areas. And one of the things when we traveled to Alaska kind of early in our company's history was there are communities right now relocating due to climate change because permafrost is changing and roads that they used to use they can no longer use and so forth. So that's one aspect of like climate, but then the energy poverty really comes about anywhere that the cost of energy is so high that people just can't afford it, or they're making decisions between food and electricity. And honestly, that's happening not just in far remote areas, but even in California, where I flew from yesterday, which is the cost of our electricity is going up. My peak electric costs are now approaching 50 cents a kilowatt hour, which I imagine in Canadian would be even more. And it's just, it's amazing how, different people now have less access to energy in certain ways. So we have to green the grid, but we have to also make sure that it's accessible to people cost-wise. And that's where we've really kept our focus, is not just clean and reliable, but affordable.
Absolutely, so important. We've got a lot of questions coming through. The first one is, how can we accelerate positive public perception of nuclear?
It's a great question. I think there's so many people doing a lot there. Influencers, like TikTok influencers, and just it's happening. Journalists are picking up the story. Documentaries. It was really fun. Just a week ago, I was part of a premiere for an Oliver Stone documentary about nuclear, and I think it pulled in many stories, not just ours, and telling the whole story about nuclear power, what's possible just with traditional tech in the future, looking forward to advanced tech and different small modular ways of building. And so I just see so many different areas where people are starting to learn about it, and then as they get excited about it, more people get excited about it. And so I think each person can play a role there. Educating your family or the people in your circles. But I think ultimately, I feel like it'll really reach a tipping point when we're actually building stuff. So not just talking about it, but building. And I think that's where we'll really see it impact people's lives directly instead of just talking about how it can.
And what timeline are we talking about there, do you think, in terms of that tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge because, every different country has a different regulatory system around that. We're working through the United States, but we're also working in other countries as well. We've been watching what's going on in Canada too, which is really exciting. But we're shooting for 2025. But by middle of the decade, building our first one, and by the end of the decade, building many more. And once we get to that mass production, so we call it our gigafactory, you can really see rapid adoption and scale.
We might click on that question on regulation, actually, because someone said, what's the level of uranium enrichment for small plants, and how is the regulatory framework navigated in your context, maybe that might be different to what people have as a reference point?
Yeah. We use low-enriched. Pretty much all technologies use low-enriched fuel because although you can, for instance, we can go for a decade without refueling, but with higher, or what people might call medium enrichments, you can go even longer or do really, really, really small sizes. So ours is not we say small, and people talk about being transportable, but it's really not that transportable. We're talking 100 tons. It's not like someone picks it up in a backpack. But what you can do with higher enrichments is do smaller scale and different unique applications. So that's exciting. Sorry, the second part of that was, first was enrichment, and then what was
the regulatory hurdles.
Yeah, each country has its own challenges there. But we've seen, CNSC, which is the regulator in Canada, do some novel things there. And so we'll see what the timelines end up. And what we've seen from the US regulator is bounds of 3 years for doing a license application. So it's really a reasonable time frame. The challenge is getting to that 3 years. So you really have to spend some time with them in what they call pre-application to get them ready for it. And we've seen them really do a lot of work in the past 5-ish years to really get ready.
Got a couple of technical questions here. Can you explain how no fuels need to be added when operating this technology? Is there a defined lifespan? And how much of a challenge is it to manage nuclear waste? You can take them together or apart, but just getting into some of the intricacies of the tech.
So with the no fuel needs to be added, I'm guessing you mean we don't need to refuel once a decade, maybe?
Yeah.
And I'm looking to you, but you didn't ask the question.
That's how I was interpreting it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, you just, the energy density is so high. We're talking about producing 15 megawatts of electricity for 10 to 20 years. And the actual volume of fuel is about a meter in diameter, a meter tall, roughly, if you're going to talk about the actual volume. And that's decades of power.
Wow.
In the United States, which is I have a fast fact there. I wish I had it with Canada. But just the nuclear waste in the United States, they've produced 20% of the United States power for about 60 years. And just for context, all of the waste from all that time, every atom of it, we know where it is, you could fit it all in a Walmart. So it's
wow.
But 95% of that energy is still left in it, such that the actual energy left in nuclear waste in the United States alone could power the entire United States for 150 years if it was only powered on that. So it's just like, it's almost like hard to comprehend how much energy is in the atom, and that's what's so promising and exciting about it.
That's extraordinary. And then the second question around how much of a challenge is it to manage nuclear waste? You mentioned that scale is quite extraordinary. It's really helpful, I think, to be able to conceptualize it like that. How much of a challenge is it to manage?
Yeah, this is one industry that not only has to manage its waste, but knows where basically every atom of it is, right? So you can imagine with coal or fossils, they can burn it and the waste goes all over our planet, and that's what we're dealing with right now. We know where every atom of waste is and we store it in containers. No one in the history of the world of nuclear power has ever been harmed by nuclear waste. So that's maybe one concept of how we've been able to manage it over the last 60 years. But like I said, there's like 95% of the energy left in it, and that's what we're excited to unlock. What we say now is like if your entire lifetime was powered only by nuclear, the amount of fuel that would be needed is about the size of a pop can. So, palmful. And that's your entire life at like a Western consumption standard of electricity. So the quantity is just not high, and that's not even with recycling, which you can really make use of the rest of the energy in the fuel.
We had a conversation about the kind of optimism or the positive framing around the nuclear branding and identity sort of in public. We've got the opposite as well. These are great questions coming through, everyone. How does the risk of nuclear catastrophe with the current Russia-Ukraine situation play into this conversation? Is that something you worry about in terms of the idea that it might set back interest, demand, preparedness for regulators to become more open to the idea of nuclear?
It's certainly a concern as far as, no one wants to lose power. I don't think anyone has an interest there in causing a nuclear catastrophe, so they may overtake the power plant or take the power or turn it off, all of which being bad things, but I think no one really has the incentive or ability to cause quite the size of catastrophe that we've seen in the past. I think it's also important to keep scale in mind, so if millions of people are dying every year due to fossil fuels, and the total number of people that have ever died due to nuclear power in 60 years is maybe on the order of maybe 10,000 at the higher end of estimates. That's just the context that I think people want to keep in perspective when we're looking at how do we deeply decarbonize globally in the scale with the rapidity that we need to do it. So I guess it's certainly concerning, but it's like we have to keep the big picture in mind of how do we deeply decarbonize with the thing that has the lowest life cycle carbon footprint, and that's really nuclear power.
Yeah, I think probably what they might be wondering about is just whether that will change public perceptions and attitudes. Do you think it's got cause for concern, or do you think there's enough on the other side of the seesaw at the moment in terms of the positives around nuclear and the opportunity in terms of the energy transition that will keep it fairly evenly balanced?
It's always hard to gauge. I think it could affect public perception, but I think it probably, my guess is it probably wouldn't really substantively alter it. I think even as some countries that do have a lot of fear around nuclear power, like for instance Germany, they make bold claims about shutting all their nuclear power down, but still have not because they need it so much. And they recognize that they need it to come anywhere close to carbon goals. So I think ultimately there might be more fear if something bad did happen, but ultimately it would be needed still. And I think different countries are going to have different public perceptions and changes over time, but I guess overall I think it will be so necessary to the fight against climate change that it won't have a measurable effect.
All right, we've got a question about the economics. What are the economics in regards to cost per megawatt and the operational side of things and time to build? Can you talk to us a little bit about the detail of that?
Yeah. So another big innovation that we felt really strongly about is not just designing these small power plants, but offering fission as a service, which sounds kind of funny, but basically providing electrons to people, so providing power. Generally speaking, our customers don't want to own and operate a nuclear power plant. They don't want to deal with the insurance, the waste, all of the management of it. So we own and operate it and sell power through PPAs, which is a familiar structure to most power structures. So a lot of times customers are used to buying PPAs, for instance, from renewables and so forth. And that's the same kind of structure we offer. So really, they don't have to take on the capital cost to build. It's not being passed off to some kind of taxpayer. They just sign a PPA that is at a cost per kilowatt hour, generally speaking, that is affordable or compelling to the customer. So we are shooting for cost per kilowatt hour that will in every market, then we'll be saving people money because they wouldn't sign the PPA if that wasn't the case, generally speaking. But what we're shooting for is to really beat the price of coal.
Okay. We've got a question around, again, continuing around that perception piece. Shows like HBO's Chernobyl frustrating for you in the way that they reinforce public perception on the dangers of nuclear energy?
Yeah, when I heard about that coming out, I was like, man, there's potential there, like for people to learn about what actually happened there. But I was mostly thinking, oh, people just get scared. It'll just reinvigorate like a fear that's kind of irrelevant because this is an old plant operated under the Soviet Union of a type that we don't even use anymore. It's not even legal to build really in the United States. It won't be licensed. So it's kind of just a historical artifact really. And but what I feel like I saw actually instead of that was really seeing people learned about nuclear power, and they got intrigued by it, and they watched the show, and they Googled things, and once they learned more facts, then they actually came out for the better as far as their understanding and of the topic. So, ironically enough, I was scared that would cause like a new wave of fear, but I think at the end of the day, it actually helped people understand it better and the actual circumstances around what happened in Chernobyl. Even though you could take issue with certain things and the way they were portrayed, but I think ultimately like the overall effect of it helped.
Was more curiosity, effectively.
Yeah.
We've got a question here. What do you say is the biggest hurdle for nuclear fission adoption? Further tech, development, commercialization, regulatory system? What would you name?
The tech is there, right? It's been demonstrated for decades. Even what we're working on has 30 years worth of experience at minimum. We're working on fast reactors, which is what is able to consume nuclear waste as fuel. There's 400 reactor years of fast reactors in the world. So we're operating off of effectively hundreds of years of experience. So the tech is there. That's not the question. Commercialization is tough, and it's one of the biggest challenges is supply chain. So that's certainly a factor. And I'd put supply chain right up there with regulatory systems, and each regulatory system, like I mentioned, is different. But I think that we're in this because we believe that the regulator, at minimum in the United States and around the world, there's ways of meeting, especially because we have safety inherent to the system, that we can demonstrate that. It's safer than anything that's ever been licensed before. If we can show that and communicate that well and give the right data, that there's a way to get it licensed. So it does just take time.
Can you expand a little bit more on the supply chain challenges?
Yeah. I think there's two. One is the historical way the nuclear industry has done supply chain, and probably eyes are going to glaze over at this point, but required really high levels of quality assurance. So, and that's good, right? You should. But at the same time, there's inefficient ways of doing that and efficient ways of doing that. So it might be analogous to like what SpaceX had to do in the space industry, where it's very slow, and they had maybe cost multiples of like 1,000 times what a part should really cost. And so SpaceX and the way they looked at it was like, we can get the same part with the same quality and do it in these creative ways. And I think that's a big challenge in our industry is like, how can we get the same quality but do it in ways that are more efficient and not just slow and kind of like outdated industry ways of doing things. So I think it's exciting to see what companies like SpaceX have been able to do in space commercialization. I think the same thing has to happen here. So that's one big thing about supply chain.
You mentioned 2025 is sort of your goal, but someone's asked a general question around what the timeline is for small advanced nuclear plants. What sort of build time are we talking, or development time?
The actual build time for our plants, we're shooting for on the order of weeks to months. So it's a small building, it's a small plant. If the parts are all fabricated in a factory, you ship them there, you build the building, and you fuel it.
When we front load regulation like hurdles on the top end, how long sort of does that add to the process?
Yeah, so at least in the United States, what you can do is you get the initial license, and then you can basically copy and paste that license for different sites, only changing what varies with each site. So that's one method that we're excited about is like you do all the safety review, you do all the quality assurance and security and operations, all those reviews, but if you do the exact same thing, you don't have to re-review all that stuff. So then the timeline on the front end for that really starts to match very closely with what is actually a very quick construction timeline.
We've only got a minute remaining, so I wanted to ask you, you mentioned right up front that you've been an entrepreneur for well over a decade. You've had the opportunity to work in all manner of entrepreneurial endeavors too before you started Oklo.
Yeah.
What's been your biggest lesson on your entrepreneurial journey to date that you wish you could have told entrepreneurial you at the start of your career?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I guess do it for you. And I think we always did. But that will fuel you because if you're trying to do it for something else or for money or for whatever, if those things don't come to pass, you'll lose interest and get disillusioned really fast. But if you're doing it because you're passionate about what you're doing and because you care about it, that will fuel you through the really hard times where money is scarce and maybe people aren't as supportive as you would like, or it's you're not getting very much sleep, or any of those number of things. If you're doing what you love, it helps you through those times. Even your co-founder, even your coworkers, you might have times of highs and lows, and so you just have to kind of have that innate to yourself, that passion and that drive.
Can you join me in thanking Caroline Cochran for a phenomenal conversation? Thank you for being here.
Thank you.